The Mafia boss's son couldn't sleep. Not until the nurse cut open his pillow and saw the curse hidden inside. Mason Hartley was only 5 years old, the sole heir to the Hartley Empire, one of the most powerful families in Chicago. This family controlled much of the city's underworld, with a fortune estimated at as much as $800 million. Mason was the only son of Silas Hartley, the man the entire Chicago underworld feared, the man who could make anyone disappear with a single nod. But for the past 6 months, Silas Hartley had been utterly powerless as he watched his son wither a little more each day. Mason couldn't sleep for more than 2 hours at a stretch. Night after night, the boy's terrified screams echoed through the 3,000-square-meter mansion in the Gold Coast. The heart-tearing wail of a 5-year-old jolted everyone in the estate awake at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. And then, when the child finally collapsed into exhausted sleep, the nightmares came again, crueler, fiercer, snapping him upright with eyes blown wide and skin drenched in cold sweat. Silas did everything he could. He spent millions of dollars hiring the best experts in the world. A neurologist from Johns Hopkins flew in, ran a battery of complex tests, and then shook his head in defeat. A pediatric psychiatrist from the Mayo Clinic spent 3 weeks observing Mason, prescribed medication, adjusted dosages, and finally admitted failure. A sleep specialist from Switzerland arrived with the most advanced equipment, measured brainwaves, analyzed sleep cycles, and still found nothing abnormal. A specialist from Germany proposed light therapy. A specialist from Japan tried acupuncture combined with meditation. 18 of the world's top experts came to this mansion. 18 brilliant minds in pediatric psychiatry and sleep medicine. And all 18 left with the same answer. They didn't know what was wrong with Mason. Medically, the boy was completely healthy. No tumor, no brain damage, no diagnosable psychiatric disorder. But Mason still couldn't sleep. He grew thinner by the day, pale as paper, with hollowed eyes and heavy, bruised shadows beneath them. And every night, he pleaded with his father using the same words. "There's something in my room, Dad. Something touches me when I sleep." Silas had his men search the room dozens of times. He replaced every piece of furniture. He even ordered a wall torn down to check whether anything had been hidden inside. There was nothing. And still Mason insisted there was something in his room, something that was hurting him. Then, when every option had run dry, when Silas Hartley was close to despair, a 27-year-old nurse from the public hospital at Cook County was summoned. Her name was Eliza Monroe. She was recommended by an old acquaintance of the family as a last resort, a desperate attempt when there was nothing left to lose. Elise didn't have degrees from famous universities. She didn't have cutting-edge equipment or a breakthrough treatment. She was just an ordinary nurse, working 14 hours a day in an overwhelmed public hospital, earning in a month what the Hartley family spent on wine at a single dinner. But Elise did one thing none of those 18 expensive experts ever thought to do. She listened to the child. She sat down at Mason's eye level, looked straight into the boy's frightened eyes, and truly listened to what he was saying. When Mason said for the 10th time that there was something in his pillow, that the pillow whispered to him every night, that something inside it was hurting him, Elise didn't brush it off the way the others had. She didn't say it was just a child's imagination. She didn't prescribe more sedatives. Instead, she did something so simple no one had thought of it. She cut the pillow open, and what she found inside made her freeze where she stood. It wasn't cotton. It wasn't feathers. It wasn't the usual filling of an expensive pillow. It was something dark, carefully sewn shut, hidden deep beneath the silk cover. Something placed there on purpose. Something carrying an intent so vicious it turned the stomach. Elise's discovery that night didn't only explain why Mason couldn't sleep. It would expose a horrifying family plot, a dark secret buried for years, and a truth so painful it could destroy everything Silas Hartley had ever believed. Because the person behind all of this, the one who wanted to ruin an innocent 5-year-old child, wasn't an enemy from outside. That person was living right under this roof. This is the story of a nurse who earned in a month what that family spent on wine at a single dinner, and how she became the only one standing between an innocent child and a darkness summoned to destroy him. And how the simplest detail, the words of a 5-year-old boy that every expensive expert ignored, became the key that unlocked the whole truth. If you want to know what Elise found inside that pillow, and who in the Hartley family committed this cruel act against an innocent child, follow us to the very end of this story. Don't forget to like and share this video with the people in your life who love dramatic stories. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, Subscribe now so you don't miss the next gripping stories from us. The black cloth pouch lay in Elise's hand, no bigger than a child's clenched fist, yet weighted as if it held all the darkness of hell. The room sank into a silence so tight it felt hard to breathe. Silas Hartley stood perfectly still, gray eyes like steel, locked on the strange object in the nurse's palm. He was 36, 6'2", broad-shouldered, and powerfully built in the way of a man accustomed to holding power. His black hair was neatly combed, his face sharply cut with a hard jawline, and his gaze so cold it could freeze anyone reckless enough to meet it. This was the man Chicago feared. This was the man even the most hardened criminals bowed to when they heard his name. This was the man who had faced death dozens of times without a tremor. But now, staring at that tiny black pouch, his hands were shaking. For the first time in his life, Silas Hartley didn't know what to do. He had dealt with enemies, with betrayal, with the most intricate political plots of the underworld. But this thing inside his son's pillow, this thing that had tortured his 5-year-old for 6 straight months, he didn't know what it was. He didn't know where it came from. And most of all, he didn't know who had put it there. A sob broke the silence. Mason rushed toward Elise, small arms clamping around her waist, his pale face pressed into the stomach of a nurse he'd met less than a day ago. He cried, each strangled hitch of breath sharp with pain. "I told you," Mason choked out, his voice trembling with desperation. "I told you there was something in the pillow. I said it over and over, and nobody believed me. Nobody believed me." The words went through Silas like a blade. He looked at his son, at the thin, shaking little body, at the small shoulders shuddering with every sob, and something inside him caved in. Nobody believed me. His son had begged for 6 months. His son had said again and again there was something in the room, something hurting him, and he, the boy's father, the most powerful man in Chicago, hadn't believed him. He had hired experts. He had spent money. He had done everything he thought was right. But he hadn't done the simplest thing. He hadn't listened to his child. Silas dropped to his knees, his kneecaps meeting the cold wood floor. He pulled Mason into his arms, held him tight against his chest, felt the boy's trembling travel straight into his own body. "I believe you," Silas whispered, his voice shaking in a way he'd never imagined it could. I'm sorry, son." For the first time in years, the most notorious Mafia boss in Chicago said the words "I'm sorry." For the first time, the man who never bowed his head to anyone knelt before a 5-year-old child. Elise stood there, the black pouch still in her hand, watching it all. She was 27, brown hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, hazel eyes bruised underneath with the heavy shadows of chronic sleeplessness. She was slim, a little drained, the kind of tired that came from meals skipped between endless shifts. She didn't belong to this world, a world of luxury mansions and powerful bosses. But standing here, witnessing what was happening, she understood something. Silas Hartley wasn't the monster people whispered about. He wasn't a cold, unfeeling machine. He was a father who was desperate, hurting, and willing to do anything for his son. The moment stretched, endless, until Silas slowly stood, and at once, the softness vanished. His gray eyes cooled again, sharp as a knife, and his voice returned to its familiar, chilled steel. "Whoever did this," he said slowly, each word dropping heavy as a death sentence, "will pay, Mr. Hartley." Elise spoke up, her voice calm in a way that was almost startling. "We need evidence first. We need to know what this is, who put it there, and why. Don't let emotion cloud your judgment." Silas turned to look at her, his eyes holding undisguised surprise. A nurse, a young nobody from a public hospital, had just spoken directly to his face, had just told him to rein in his emotions. No one in Chicago spoke to him like that, but before he could react, a choked sob rose from the doorway. Rosa stood there, the nanny who had cared for Mason for the past 3 years, tears streaming down her face. "I told you," she sobbed, her voice trembling with pain. "I said something wasn't right. I said it again and again, and nobody believed me." Elise set the black cloth pouch on the oak desk in Silas's study, directly beneath the bright blaze of the chandelier. The room was vast, lined with bookcases that rose to the ceiling, hung with expensive paintings, furnished in lavish pieces. Yet in this moment it all seemed to fade, leaving only that small pouch at the center of the desk, like an object that didn't belong to this world. Silas stood across from her, his face locked into a hardness that looked carved from stone. At his side was Vincent Crane, his most trusted right hand, A 40-year-old man with a thick, powerful build and the keen eyes of someone who had survived more life and death fights than he could count. Rosa hovered farther back, hands clenched together, tears still clinging to her cheeks. Elise drew a deep breath, then carefully opened the mouth of the pouch. A sharp, pungent stench of dried herbs surged out at once, making Rosa clamp a hand over her nose and turn away. It was an ugly smell, like a blend of rotting greenery and something older, something darker. Elise used the tip of a pen to tease each item out, laying them on the desk in a neat line. The first was a small tuft of hair, light brown, soft as silk. Elise glanced toward Mason, curled tight on the sofa in the corner, then back to the hair. The color, the softness, a perfect match. This was Mason's hair. The second thing made her shiver. A few tiny nail clippings, too small to belong to an adult. The nails of a child. Mason's nails. Next came a handful of crumbled, dried herbs, the source of the harsh odor spreading through the room. Elise didn't recognize the plant, but she knew with certainty it didn't belong to any ordinary medicine or common spice. Then she drew out a photograph, and Rosa's breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of Mason, a portrait the family had taken about a year ago, but the photograph had been torn in half, the rip running straight down the middle of the boy's face, splitting the innocent smile of a 5-year-old into 2 jagged pieces. The next item was an old sheet of paper, yellowed with age, folded into quarters. Elise unfolded it and saw strange symbols written in red ink that had darkened into a brown so deep it looked almost black. She didn't recognize the language. She didn't know what it meant. But the moment her eyes traced those jagged strokes, a chill slid up her spine. And then her fingers touched the last object at the bottom of the pouch, something hard and round and ice cold. She lifted it out and placed it on the desk. A wedding ring, white gold, finely made, elegant in its delicate lines. Elise picked it up, tilted it beneath the light, and saw an inscription on the inside. Before she could read it, Silas stepped forward and snatched the ring from her hand. He stared at the inner band, and it was as if all the blood drained from his face at once. His lips moved as he read the engraving. Caroline and Silas, forever. He stood there, unmoving as a statue, the ring trembling in his shaking palm. 2 years ago, on the day of his wife's funeral, Silas had placed that ring into Caroline's hand one last time. He had bent down and kissed her forehead, cold and colorless, then slid their wedding band onto the 4th finger of the woman he had loved more than anyone in the world. He had watched the casket close, watched it lowered slowly into the grave, and he had believed that ring would stay with her forever, just like the vow they had given each other on their wedding day. "This ring," Silas said, his voice hoarse and trembling in a way Vincent had never heard in 15 years at his side. "I buried it with my wife." The room sank into a silence so suffocating no one dared breathe too loudly. No one dared move. "Someone," Silas went on, each word forced out as if he were lifting a stone that weighed 1,000 pounds, "dug up my wife's grave. To take this ring." Elise felt her stomach tighten into a hard knot. She had thought this was only some crude superstition, maybe a jealous servant, maybe someone trying to frighten the Hartley family. But this, digging up a dead woman's grave for a wedding ring, placing it with a child's hair and nail clippings inside a curse pouch, this wasn't a prank. This wasn't a shallow, impulsive act. This was calculated, planned, cruel to the marrow. Whoever did it had access to Mason's room without raising suspicion. Whoever did it knew where Caroline was buried and had the ability to disturb the grave without anyone noticing. Whoever did it didn't only want to hurt Mason. They wanted to desecrate Caroline, to drag a dead woman into a plot meant to destroy her own son. They wanted to stitch a mother's death to a child's ruin. Silas closed his fist around the ring until his knuckles went white. When he lifted his head, his gray eyes were no longer cold steel. They were a storm, the raw, primal fury of a man who had just watched the memory of his late wife violated in the most brutal way imaginable. "Find who did this," he said, his voice so cold the air in the room seemed to thicken and freeze. "At any cost." Silas didn't waste another second. He turned to Vincent with a blade-cold look and gave the order in a voice that didn't allow disagreement. "Lock down the entire estate. No one in or out until they found who did this." Vincent nodded and immediately pulled out his phone, calling security to post men at every exit. The main gate, the side gate, the back door, by the kitchen, even the narrow staff paths, all of it sealed tight within 10 minutes. The 3,000-square-meter mansion turned into a luxurious prison in the blink of an eye, and everyone inside became a suspect. Vincent returned to the study with a tablet in his hand, his face set and severe. He laid out a list of the people who'd had access to Mason's bedroom over the past 6 months. First was Helena Hartley, Silas's mother, 67, living in the mansion and in the habit of going into her grandson's room often. Second was Derek Hartley, Silas's younger brother, 32, not living in the estate but visiting frequently, always free to come and go without notice. Third was Rosa Mendez, the nanny, the one who spent the most time with Mason, caring for him 12 hours a day for the past 3 years. Fourth was Dr. Richard Weiss, the family doctor, who had examined Mason multiple times in recent months as the insomnia grew severe. And finally, 3 housekeepers who rotated in shifts. Vincent paused, then added that there was one strange detail he'd just discovered. The security camera in the corner of Mason's room had been out of service since 7 months ago, right around the period before the boys' sleep problems began. The maintenance record said the camera was shut off by request, but it didn't record who made that request. Silas ground his teeth and ordered Vincent to find out immediately who had asked for the camera to be disabled. Elise stood silent, watching, her mind working without rest. She realized whoever had done this was extraordinarily careful, methodical. They knew exactly where the camera in Mason's room was positioned. They knew how to disable it without raising suspicion. They had access to the boys' room in a way that wouldn't draw attention. And they had been planning this for at least 7 months, even before Mason began screaming every night. This wasn't the impulsive act of someone unhinged. This was a long game, carefully prepared, carried out by someone who understood how this mansion ran. Someone the Hartleys trusted so completely they never thought to question them. Silas looked over the list again, gray eyes stopping on each name. His mother, his brother, the nanny, the doctor, the housekeepers. One of them had betrayed him in the cruelest way imaginable. One of them had tried to destroy his son. He lifted his head and said in a voice like ice that they would start with the person who had the most opportunity. Every gaze in the room turned toward Rosa, the nanny standing trembling in the corner, her face drained pale with fear. Vincent stepped forward with the tablet and began laying out the details on Rosa Mendez, 34, Mexican, the Hartley family's nanny for 3 years. She had more access to Mason than anyone else in the mansion, caring for the boy 12 hours a day, from the moment he woke until the moment he went to sleep. Rosa was the one who bathed Mason, fed him, played with him, and most of all, she was the one who went into his room the most at night whenever the child cried or screamed. Vincent continued, his tone even, as if reading an indictment. Rosa came from Mexico, a country with a long tradition of curanderos, folk healers who practiced spiritual rituals and charms. Her culture wasn't unfamiliar with things like the kind of curse pouch they just found inside Mason's pillow. And most suspicious of all, Vincent added, swiping the screen to display a bank statement. Rosa had sent a large sum of money back to Mexico 2 weeks earlier, $15,000. That was an enormous amount compared to a nanny's salary, and there was no recorded explanation for where it had come from. Silas listened, his face showing nothing at all. He said only one sentence, "Take her to the interrogation room." 2 bodyguards moved at once, each of them gripping one of Rosa's arms. The nanny's face went white as paper, her eyes wide with terror. She started to struggle, her mouth spilling words in a frantic rush, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that she was innocent. But the guards didn't hesitate, dragging her out of the room like a puppet. "Wait, Mr. Hartley." Elise's voice cut through the air, and everyone in the room turned to look at her. The young nurse stood there with her back straight, her gaze fixed on Silas without a flicker of fear. "Rosa is the one who called me here," Elise said, her voice calm but firm. "She's the only person in this house who realized something wasn't normal with Mason. She's the only one who believed he wasn't simply suffering from a sleep disorder. If she's the one responsible, why would she call someone in to uncover her own crime? Why would she expose herself?" Silas turned to Elise, his gray eyes narrowing. "Maybe that's exactly the performance," he replied, cold as winter metal. "A smart person knows how to step forward and play the rescuer so no one suspects them. She calls you in, you find what's in the pillow, and now everyone thinks she's the good one. That's the oldest tactic in every plot. Miss Monroe." Elise wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Silas's logic made sense. It made perfect sense. And she had no proof of Rosa's innocence beyond her own instinct. Rosa was taken to a small room on the lower floor, the door locked from the outside, 2 guards posted on either side. Through the closed door, Elise could hear the nanny's sobbing and her desperate pleading. "I didn't hurt Mason," Rosa cried out between broken breaths. "I love that boy like he's my own. I've cared for him for 3 years. I would never hurt him. Please believe me. I called Nurse Elise because I wanted to save him, not to harm him." Elise stood outside that door, listening, and something in her tightened with unease. She'd worked in healthcare for nearly 6 years, had cared for hundreds of patients, had spoken with countless people in the most fragile moments of their lives. She'd learned to tell the difference between truth and lies, between honest pain and a performance built to deceive. And her instinct, the instinct sharpened by years of experience, was telling her Rosa Mendez wasn't the one. Her crying was too real, her panic too sincere. The look in her eyes whenever she watched Mason always carried a tenderness that couldn't be faked. But instinct wasn't evidence. A feeling couldn't be carried into a courtroom. If Elise wanted to save Rosa, she had to find the real truth. She had to find the person truly behind all of this. She went back to the study, where Silas sat behind the desk, his eyes locked on Caroline's wedding ring. "Mr. Hartley," Elise said, her voice steady but insistent. "Give me one chance to speak with Rosa alone. Give me one chance to find the truth before you decide anything." Silas studied Elise for a long time, his gray eyes weighing her, measuring her. At last he nodded, allowing the nurse to see Rosa, but warning her she had 30 minutes. Elise didn't waste a moment. She went straight to the room where Rosa was being held. When the door opened, she saw Rosa curled in on herself on a wooden chair in the corner, eyes swollen and red from crying, her face pale and drawn. The nanny lifted her head at the sound, and when she saw Elise, something like a thin, fragile hope flashed in her gaze. Elise pulled up a chair and sat across from Rosa, close enough to build trust, far enough not to crowd her. She spoke as gently as she could, telling her she wanted to believe her. She truly did. But Rosa had to tell her the truth, all of it, without hiding anything. Rosa looked at Elise and tears started again. She took a deep, shaking breath and began. "The $15,000, Rosa said, her voice rough from too much crying, was for her mother's treatment. Rosa's mother was still in Mexico. She'd had kidney disease for years, and now she needed dialysis regularly if she was going to stay alive. Medical costs in Mexico weren't as high as in the United States, but for a poor family like Rosa's, it was still a crushing number. Rosa had saved for 3 years working for the Hartleys, and with the bonus Mr. Silas had given her last Christmas, she had finally gathered enough to send home to her mother. "My mother is dying," Rosa sobbed. "She's everything I have left in this world." Elise listened without interrupting, letting Rosa pour it all out. And then Rosa told her something she had never told anyone in the 3 years she'd worked here. She had once had a little boy, a son named Miguel, only 4 years old. 5 years ago, Miguel died in gang violence back home. The child had been playing outside when a stray bullet came flying through. Rosa couldn't save him. She held his body in her arms and screamed in the street, surrounded by blood. After that, she left Mexico, came to America, trying to outrun the memory of that pain, and then she met Mason. "When I look at Mason," Rosa said, her voice breaking apart, "I see Miguel. The same age, the same big eyes, the same innocent smile. I love that boy like he's my own. I care for him as if he were the child I lost. I would never hurt him. Never." Rosa went on, saying she had sensed something was wrong with Mason long before the nightly screaming began. She could feel something dark gathering around the boy, but no one believed her. Who would believe a Mexican nanny talking about spirits and curses? Back home, people called it mal de ojo, the evil eye, a curse placed on someone by a person with malicious intent. Rosa knew that feeling. She had grown up with stories like that, and she knew when someone was being cursed. Elise watched Rosa's eyes, searching for the seams of a lie, for a performance put on for survival, but she found nothing except pain. The pain of a mother who had lost her child, the pain of a woman desperate to save her own mother, the pain of a nanny who loved the child in her care like flesh and blood. Elise had met hundreds of patients, had seen all kinds of people in the most fragile moments of their lives. She knew the difference between deception and desperation. And Rosa wasn't lying. Rosa loved Mason, truly. "Do you suspect anyone?" Elise asked softly. Rosa hesitated, eyes flickering fast, as if she were afraid of something. She said she didn't dare speak, but there were things she had seen, things that made her uneasy. "Mrs. Helena," Rosa whispered, as if afraid someone might hear. "She goes into Mason's room at night, when the whole house is asleep." And the way she looked at the boy, Rosa continued, her voice trembling, didn't look like a grandmother's love. There was something cold in those eyes, something that frightened Rosa every time she saw it. Elise stood, set a hand on Rosa's shoulder, and squeezed gently. She told the nanny she would speak to Mr. Hartley, that Rosa wasn't guilty, and she would prove it. Elise returned to Silas's study with the information she'd just gathered. He was still sitting there, gray eyes fixed on Caroline's wedding ring resting on the desk. When Elise stepped in, he lifted his head, waiting. She gave him a concise account of what Rosa had told her, about the $15,000 sent back to Mexico to pay for her mother's treatment, about the 4-year-old son who had died in gang violence 5 years earlier, about the love Rosa held for Mason as if the boy were her own child. Elise said she believed Rosa was innocent, that the nanny had no reason to harm Mason, that if anything, she loved the child more than she loved herself. Silas listened without expression, but at the end, he gave a reluctant nod. Still, he ordered that Rosa remain in the estate until everything was clarified, not as a prisoner, but as a precaution. Elise didn't argue. She understood that in the present situation, it was the best compromise she could get. But there's something else, Elise said, lowering her voice. Rosa mentioned someone, Mrs. Helena, your mother. She said Helena goes into Mason's room at night, when the whole house is asleep, and the way she looks at him, according to Rosa, doesn't look like a grandmother's love. Silas went silent. He didn't deny it and he didn't agree. He just sat there, eyes focused on nothing, as if he were processing something too heavy to react to right away. Elise watched him for a moment, then chose to push the conversation farther. Mr. Hartley, she said gently but firmly. That ring, the wedding ring in the curse pouch. I need to understand more about your wife. How did she die? Silas looked at Elise, and for a brief second she saw pain pierce through the cold armor he always wore. He told her, his voice low and slow, that Caroline had died in a car accident 2 years ago. That day she'd been driving Mason to the park, like she often did. On the way back, the car lost control going downhill, slammed into the median, and rolled into the ravine. Caroline died at the scene, but Mason, 3 years old in the back seat, survived in a way that felt miraculous, with only a few minor scratches. The police investigated and concluded the brakes had failed. A tragic accident. Silas had accepted that conclusion. He had been devastated, shattered, but he hadn't doubted it. Elise listened, fell quiet for a moment, then asked the question she knew would change everything. Did anyone investigate why the brakes failed? And who had access to Caroline's car before the accident? Silas froze. His gray eyes widened, and Elise could see the gears in his mind spinning hard and fast. He had never thought of this. For 2 years he had lived in grief and self-blame for not being with his wife in her final moments. But he had never questioned the true cause of the crash. He turned to Vincent and gave the order in a rough, strained voice. Check Caroline's maintenance records, every service visit in the month before the accident. Vincent nodded and left the room. 10 minutes later he returned, with the tablet in his hand, and a tension on his face that looked almost unnatural. He reported that Caroline's car had been taken in for maintenance 2 days before the accident. The records showed the service had been requested by Helena Hartley, on the grounds that she wanted the car checked for her daughter-in-law before a long trip. The room fell into a deadly silence. Silas shot to his feet, the chair behind him crashing to the floor with a loud bang, but he didn't even notice. His face was white as paper, his hands clenched into trembling fists. He stood there in the middle of the lavish study like a man who'd just been struck by lightning. His mother, Helena Hartley, the woman who had given birth to him, raised him, the woman he had called mother for 36 years. That woman had requested the maintenance on Caroline's car only 2 days before the brakes mysteriously failed and stole his wife's life. Elise looked at Silas and understood his world was collapsing right in front of her. But she still had to say what needed to be said. Mr. Hartley, she said, calm and steady. This isn't proof. These are only suspicious coincidences. We need more information, more evidence before we conclude anything. Silas turned to her, and now his gray eyes held something Elise had never seen in him before. The absolute disorientation of a man realizing he might have been living inside a lie for years. He spoke slowly, each word falling heavy as stone. If my mother killed my wife, I will. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. His eyes said the rest. The living room door opened, and Helena Hartley walked in. It was the first time Elise had seen the woman in person, and her first impression was of a perfection so polished it felt almost unsettling. Helena was 67, yet she carried the beauty of an upper-class woman who'd been carefully maintained all her life. Her silver hair was curled into place without a single strand out of line, her face lightly made up but impeccably done, her clothes expensive, their tailoring flawless against a figure that was still slender. She stood with her back perfectly straight, her chin slightly lifted, the posture of someone used to being served and used to controlling everything around her. But when Elise looked at Helena's smile, she noticed something strange. The smile never reached her eyes. "Silas, what's going on?" Helena asked, her voice carrying the worried cadence of a concerned mother. "Why is the house locked down?" "I heard something happened to Mason. How is he? I'm so worried." Elise remained in the corner, watching the woman with the eyes of someone trained to read people in their most vulnerable states. The questions were right. The tone was right. Even the expression on Helena's face was right, and yet something was off. There was a stiffness in the way Helena spoke, as if she were reciting lines she'd rehearsed. Her concern didn't flow naturally from within. It sat on her like a cloak she'd put on. Helena turned toward Elise, her eyes narrowing for a brief second before she offered a polite smile. "And who are you? I haven't seen you here before," Silas answered for Elise, his voice calm, yet edged with something colder than usual. "This is Elise Monroe, a nurse we brought in to care for Mason." Helena nodded, but the way she looked at Elise held something else. Not welcome, not gratitude, but appraisal. A measuring look, as if she were deciding whether this young nurse was a threat. "So what did you find in my grandson's room?" Helena asked, her voice still wearing its mask of concern. But Elise noticed the question came too fast, too directly, as if it were the one thing Helena truly wanted to know. "Nothing significant, ma'am," Elise replied evenly, keeping her face perfectly blank. Throughout the exchange, Silas stood silent, studying his mother. For the first time in 36 years, he was looking at Helena with a wholly different kind of attention. He searched for signs he'd never bothered to notice before. Was the worry in her voice real or performed? When she spoke Mason's name, did her eyes carry a grandmother's love? Or had it all been a flawless act, played out for years? Helena seemed to sense the shift in her son's gaze. She paused for a heartbeat, the smile on her mouth tightening. "Silas, why are you looking at me like that?" she asked, her voice still gentle, but with a thread of tension woven beneath it. "It's nothing, Mother," Silas replied, his face returning to the familiar mask of indifference. "Go rest. When there's news, I'll tell you." Helena looked at him for a moment, then glanced at Elise, before she nodded and left the room. Her steps were still composed, her back still straight, but Elise could have sworn she saw Helena's shoulders tense slightly as she passed through the doorway. After Helena left, Elise asked Silas for permission to see Mason. She needed to hear the story from the boy himself, from the only person who might know who had been coming into his room at night. Silas nodded, and Elise went to the room where Mason was being watched by Rosa. She crouched to the child's eye level, offering a small, gentle smile to build trust. "Mason," she asked in the softest voice she could manage, "can you tell me about the people who come into your room, especially at night, when you're getting ready to sleep?" Mason looked at Elise with wide eyes still marked by sleepless nights and fear. He stayed quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he began. "Grandma comes at night," Mason said in a small voice. "She says she's checking on me. She sits on my bed for a long time. She touches my pillow and whispers something, but I can't hear what she says." Elise felt her heart begin to beat faster, but she kept her expression calm so she wouldn't frighten him. "Does Grandma say anything to you?" she asked gently. Mason nodded, a flicker of sadness passing through his eyes. "She says I look too much like Mommy. She says every time she looks at me, she remembers Mommy. And then she says..." The boy stopped, as if he were trying to remember the exact words. "She says she wishes I could be with Mommy in heaven. She says Uncle Derek deserves it more than Dad. She says, if I wasn't here, Uncle Derek would get everything." A cold wave ran up Elise's spine. She had to use every ounce of self-control not to let the shock show on her face. A 5-year-old child had just, without meaning to, revealed the motive behind everything that was happening. Helena wanted Mason removed so Derek, her younger son, would become the sole heir to the Hartley empire. She wanted her own grandson dead, so her son could inherit it all. And now Elise understood why Caroline's wedding ring had ended up inside the curse pouch. Helena didn't only want Mason dead. She wanted to bind him to his dead mother, wanted the child to follow her into the grave. Elise reported to Silas what Mason had told her, that Helena came into the boy's room at night, that she whispered over the pillow, that she said she wished he could be with his mother in heaven, and most of all, that she said Derek deserved it more, that if Mason weren't here, Derek would get everything. Silas listened in silence, his face giving nothing away, but his hands clenched so hard his knuckles turned white. When Elise finished, he didn't say a word. He only ordered Vincent to bring Derek to the estate immediately. 30 minutes later, Derek Hartley was escorted into the living room by 2 guards. It was the first time Elise had seen Silas's younger brother, and she recognized the difference between them at once. Derek was 32, and in a conventional sense he was more handsome than Silas, with softer features, finer lines, and blue eyes inherited from their mother instead of his brother's cold gray. But where Silas radiated power and control in every step, every movement, Derek seemed to have none of it. He walked in with his gaze darting away, unable to look anyone in the eye, fidgeting like a child called into the principal's office. His fingers kept worrying the hem of his shirt, an unconscious habit of someone teetering on the edge of panic. His clothes were clearly expensive, but wrinkled, as if he'd worn them for days straight, the mark of a man who no longer cared about taking care of himself. "Do you know what's happening to Mason?" Silas asked bluntly, his voice ice cold. Derek flinched, blinking fast. "What? Mason, what's wrong? Is he hurt? Is something happening to him?" he asked in a rush. But Elise noticed his voice lacked real surprise, as if he were trying to sound ignorant while already knowing something. "Don't pretend," Silas cut in, his voice sharp as a blade. "You know something. Talk." Derek fell silent. His eyes dropped to the floor, his mouth pressed tight as if he were holding words back with his teeth. He didn't answer, and that silence was more suspicious than any defense could have been. Vincent stepped forward with a thick file in his hands. He reported to Silas in an even tone that Derek currently owed $2 million in gambling debt. The creditors had been threatening him for 3 months, and he couldn't pay. If Mason were gone, Derek would become the sole heir to the Hartley empire, $800 million, enough to wipe the debt clean and live in comfort for the rest of his life. Silas's face shifted as he absorbed it. He moved toward Derek and towered over him, the pressure rolling off him so heavily Derek took a step back. "You needed money so badly you'd hurt your own nephew?" Silas asked, his voice trembling with rage. "You let Mother do this to Mason so you could inherit. You sold your nephew to pay your gambling debt." Derek broke down, tears spilling down a handsome face gone ragged with strain. "I didn't hurt Mason," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I swear I didn't. I love Mason. He's my nephew. He's my blood. I know I'm a failure. I know I don't deserve anything. I know I've disappointed you again and again. But I would never hurt Mason. Never." Elise stood in the corner, watching Derek closely. She'd seen every kind of person in the hospital. People who lied to hide an illness. People who faked pain to get prescriptions. People who performed to cheat insurance. She knew the difference between real fear and manufactured fear. And Derek was truly afraid. There was no denying it. But he wasn't afraid of being arrested. He was afraid of something else. Someone else. Derek's eyes kept flicking toward the door, as if he feared someone out there was listening. Every time Silas mentioned their mother, Derek seemed to shrink, not with guilt, but with dread. He was afraid of Helena. He knew what she had done, or at least he suspected, but he was too terrified to say it out loud. Elise stepped closer to Silas and spoke low, just for the two of them. "He isn't the one," she said with quiet certainty, "but he's hiding something. He knows more than he's saying. Let me talk to him alone." Silas looked at Elise, then at Derek, shaking and drenched in tears. At last he nodded and walked out, taking Vincent with him, leaving Elise alone with the Mafia boss's younger brother as he fell apart. Elise left Derek alone for 15 minutes before she came back. She found him in the small sitting room by the staircase, curled in on himself in an old armchair, a bottle of whiskey more than half gone on the table. His face was flushed with alcohol, his eyes dull as they stared into nothing. Elise didn't speak. She simply sat in the chair across from him and waited. She'd learned that sometimes silence was the most powerful tool for making someone open up. People feared silence. They felt the need to fill it with words. And when they were drunk, when the walls of defense had already collapsed, they would say things they would never admit when sober. Derek poured himself another drink, swallowed it in a single gulp, and then began to talk, his words already slightly slurred. "Do you know what it feels like to live in someone's shadow your entire life?" he asked without looking at Elise. Silas was always perfect. Smart, strong, cold, decisive. Father loved him, admired him, put every expectation on his shoulders. Silas was the chosen heir since he was a boy, the one who would take over the Hartley Empire, the pride of my father. Derek gave a bitter laugh and poured another glass. And me. I was the failure. The son father never even bothered to look at. I wasn't as smart as Silas, not as strong as Silas, not as cold as Silas. I was just a faint shadow of my brother, always behind him, always compared, always falling short. My father didn't even bother to scold me when I messed up, because he didn't care enough to scold. He paused, his eyes reddened. Whether from the whiskey or from tears held back, Elise couldn't tell. Only Mother, Derek went on, his voice softening. Mother was the only one who said I mattered. She said Silas was cold, that he had no feelings, that all he cared about was work and power. She said I was the one with a heart, with tenderness, the one who deserved to be loved. She was always there for me when the whole world turned its back. Elise listened without interrupting, letting Derek spill what he had likely carried inside for years. Mother always said, Derek whispered, his voice beginning to tremble. Mother said if Mason wasn't here, I'd be the heir. Mother said Silas could have the power, but Mason would be the one who got everything when Silas died. And me? I'd have nothing. Derek suddenly lifted his head and looked straight at Elise, his eyes raw with desperation. But I don't want that, he almost shouted. I don't want my nephew to die. Mason is an innocent child. He calls me Uncle Derek. He runs to hug me every time I visit. He looks at me like I matter. I love him. I never wanted to hurt him. Elise studied Derek for a moment, then asked gently, her voice carrying no judgment at all. Derek, did your mother do anything to help you? Anything to make you the heir? Derek went rigid. The bottle in his hand stopped midair. He looked at Elise, then down, then back at her, as if wrestling with himself. Finally, after a stretch of silence that felt like it strangled the air, he whispered, My mother knows a woman. They call her Madame Celeste. Derek continued, his voice so low Elise had to lean forward to hear. She goes to see that woman out in the suburbs. I don't know why. Mother never says. But every time she comes back from seeing her, she asks me about Mason. Is Mason doing well? Is Mason sleeping? Does Mason cry at night? At first I didn't notice, but then I realized she asked too much, cared too much, like she was waiting for something to happen to the boy. Derek set the bottle down and cradled his head in both hands. Please don't tell my brother I told you, he begged, his voice shaking. I'm scared. I'm scared of my mother. You don't understand how terrifying she is. She'll do anything, to get what she wants. She can smile at someone while she's planning to destroy them. She can hold her grandson in her arms while she's cursing him. Elise rose to her feet, and in her mind, the final piece slid into place. Madame Celeste, the mysterious woman in the suburbs, was the key that could break everything open. Elise reported to Silas what Derek had let slip while drunk. The name Madame Celeste made Silas order Vincent to dig up everything on the woman at once. Vincent tapped into the full underworld information web of the Hartley family. Eyes and ears scattered across Chicago, people willing to sell any scrap of knowledge in exchange for protection or cash from the most powerful boss in the city. Within a few hours, Vincent had an answer. Madame Celeste, real name Celeste Beaumont, 55, Haitian, ran a small shop in the southern suburbs of Chicago. The store sold herbs, candles, spiritual supplies, and according to rumors in the underworld, she also took on special work for clients willing to pay a high price. Silas immediately prepared to go see her, but Elise stopped him at the door. I'm coming with you, she said, not as a suggestion, but as a statement. Silas looked at her with irritation. This isn't your business, he said coldly. I can handle it. You need someone to keep you calm. Elise shot back, meeting his threat without flinching. We need testimony from that woman, not a corpse. If you kill her before she talks, we lose the only evidence that can implicate the person truly behind all of this. Silas stared at Elise for several long, endless seconds, then finally gave a reluctant nod. They drove through the city as night began to fall. Madame Celeste's shop sat in a narrow alley in a part of town that wasn't busy, wedged between a laundromat that had closed down and a secondhand store that looked abandoned. A worn sign hung over the door with faded lettering. Madame Celeste, Spiritual Healing. A weak yellow light seeped out from inside through a dusty window curtain. Silas pushed the door open and walked in, Elise close behind. The heavy smell of incense hit them at once, mixed with the scent of countless dried herbs hanging from the ceiling and piled on old wooden shelves. Candles in every color and size lined the walls, beside glass jars filled with things Elise didn't want to know. A woman stood behind the counter, arranging herb jars. She was 55, dark-skinned, Haitian, with long black hair braided into many small plaits that fell down her back. Her eyes were sharp as knives, and when she lifted her head and saw who had stepped into her shop, her face blanched in an instant. Everyone in Chicago knew Silas Hartley. Everyone in Chicago knew you didn't want that man showing up at your door at night. "I don't know what you want," Madame Celeste said, trying to keep her composure, though her hands were trembling slightly. "I only sell herbs and candles. I don't have anything to do with your people's business." Silas didn't speak. He walked up to the counter, pulled the black cloth pouch from his coat, and set it on the glass with a hard, dry sound. "Is this yours?" he asked, his voice ice-cold. Madame Celeste looked down at the curse pouch, and Elise saw the exact moment she recognized her own work. The woman's face changed, from pale to ashen, and the sharpness in her eyes flooded with fear. She opened her mouth to deny it, but Silas spoke first. "You can tell me the truth and leave this city tonight with enough money to start over somewhere else," he said slowly. "Or you can keep lying, and I'll make sure no one in Chicago, or anywhere else, ever finds you again. Choose." Madame Celeste looked at Silas, then at Elise, then back at the pouch on the counter like it was a death sentence. Finally, she let out a long breath, her shoulders slumping in surrender. She confessed everything. Helena Hartley had come to see her 7 months earlier, a luxurious woman with eyes as cold as a snake's. Helena had asked for a work. That was the exact word she used. A work meant to send the child after his mother. Helena provided everything Madame Celeste needed. The child's hair, the child's nail clippings, a photograph, and most importantly, a wedding ring Helena claimed she had taken from her daughter-in-law's grave. Helena paid $50,000 in cash, didn't ask the price, didn't bargain, only handed over the money, and demanded the work be finished within a week. "I did what she asked," Madame Celeste said, her voice stripped of any pride. "I didn't ask why. Money is money. I didn't think about the consequences." On the drive back to the estate, Silas sat in silence behind the wheel, eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. Elise sat beside him, silent as well. She knew there were no words that could comfort him now. He had a complete chain of proof, a direct confession from the woman who made the curse, physical evidence inside the black pouch, a clear motive, an opportunity that couldn't be denied. It all pointed to one person, his own mother, and they both knew that tomorrow would be the hardest day of Silas Hartley's life. It was late at night. The estate lay sunk in silence, but the light in Silas's study was still on. He sat alone behind the large oak desk, 2 framed photographs laid out in front of him, pulled from a drawer. One was their wedding photo, him and Caroline, young and smiling, unaware of how cruel fate would be to them. The other was a picture of Mason as a newborn, a tiny, flushed life cradled in his mother's arms. Beside the frames sat a glass of whiskey filled to the brim, untouched. Silas didn't want to be drunk. He wanted to be clear-headed for what was coming tomorrow. A soft knock made him lift his head. Elise stood in the doorway, worry on her face. She didn't speak. She simply stepped inside and sat in the chair across from Silas, as if she understood that sometimes a quiet presence meant more than 1,000 words. "Tomorrow I might lose my mother," Silas said after a long silence, his voice low and tired. Then a bitter laugh slipped out of him. "No, not that. I lost my mother the moment she decided to kill my wife. The woman I've called mother for 36 years. I don't even know who she is anymore." Elise didn't offer hollow comfort. She knew there were no words that could smooth this kind of pain. Instead, she reached out and took Silas's hand where it rested on the desk. He looked at her, and for the first time since they'd met, Elise didn't see coldness or power in those gray eyes. She saw only the exhaustion and hurt of a man carrying too much. Small footsteps sounded in the hallway. Mason stood in the doorway, clutching an old teddy bear tight against his chest, his eyes still heavy with sleep. "I can't sleep," the boy whispered. "I miss Mommy." Silas opened his arms and Mason ran to him, climbing into his lap, pressing his face into his father's chest. Silas held his son and whispered into his ear, "I'll protect you, forever." Elise watched father and son holding each other under the soft yellow light, and she knew that no matter what happened tomorrow, she would be here. The next morning, Silas summoned Helena to his study. He'd prepared everything the night before, arranging every piece of evidence across the desktop like a silent indictment. The curse pouch lay in the center. Beside it were Caroline's wedding ring, the maintenance records for the car, and a thick packet containing messages Vincent had extracted from Helena's phone. Vincent stood at the door with a face like stone, and Elise stayed in the corner, trying to melt into the shadows so she could watch everything unfold. The door opened and Helena Hartley walked in with a poise that hadn't cracked at all. She was still dressed in expensive clothes, her silver hair still perfectly groomed, her chin still lifted as if she were entering a society luncheon instead of an interrogation. "Silas, why did you call me in here?" Helena asked, her tone carrying the faint annoyance of someone being interrupted. "I'm very busy." But then her eyes swept across the items on the desk, and Elise saw the moment she understood. Helena's step faltered for the briefest instant, only a second, before she gathered herself and continued forward as if nothing had happened. But that single second was enough. Silas had seen it. Elise had seen it. Silas didn't waste time. He shoved the curse pouch toward Helena, his voice hard as steel. "Explain." Helena looked down at the black cloth, her face as blank as a statue. "What is this? I don't understand what you're talking about." "Don't pretend," Silas said. And now there was a tremor in his voice where anger was being held back with force. "This was found inside Mason's pillow. It had his hair, his nail clippings, his photo torn in half, and the wedding ring I buried with my wife." Helena lifted her head and looked straight into her son's eyes with a fury so perfectly performed it could have fooled anyone who didn't know better. "You're accusing me?" she snapped. "Your own mother? The woman who gave birth to you, who raised you. I love Mason. I would never hurt my grandson." Silas pulled out the page with Madame Celeste's statement. "She says you came to her 7 months ago and asked for a work meant to send the child after his mother. You gave her Mason's hair, Mason's nails, and the ring you said you took from your daughter-in-law's grave. You paid $50,000 in cash." Helena didn't flinch. "That woman is lying." She shot back immediately. "She wants your money. She'll say anything you want to hear if you threaten her or pay her." Silas produced another file. "The camera in Mason's room was disabled 7 months ago at your request. Caroline's maintenance records show you're the one who requested her car be checked 2 days before the brakes failed and my wife died. And this," he said, tossing the final packet onto the desk, "is your message thread with Madame Celeste over 7 months, including you asking why the work wasn't taking effect and telling her to make it stronger." Helena's face began to change. Her hands trembled slightly, but she still tried to hold herself together, still tried to stand tall with her chin raised. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny again, but there were no words left that could hold. The proof was too much, too clear, too impossible to escape. And then something Elise didn't expect happened. Helena laughed, a cold, terrifying laugh that rang through the room like ice cracking. "You want the truth?" Helena said, and now her voice had lost its polished grace and turned sharp and venomous. "Fine, I'll give you the truth." She stepped closer to Silas, her eyes glittering with a wild light Elise had never seen in anyone before. "It's all for the family. Derek is the one who deserves to inherit this empire, not you. You've always been cold, without feeling. All you care about is work and power. You're exactly like your father, a machine without a heart. Derek is the one with tenderness, with a heart, the one who deserves to be loved." Helena's voice rose, higher, more unhinged. "And Mason? He looks too much like Caroline. Every time I see him, I remember the woman who stole my son. Caroline made you a stranger. Before you married her, you listened to me. You cared about me, about Derek, about the family. But after you married her, all you cared about was her and your work. I lost you to that woman." She spat the words, saliva flashing at the corner of her mouth. "Derek needs a chance. Derek needs to be the heir. Without Mason, Derek will have everything. That child is the only obstacle between Derek and the future he deserves." Silas stood motionless, every word from Helena striking him like a knife driven straight into his chest. He stared at his mother, the woman who had given birth to him, held him when he was small, taught him his first words, and now stood in front of him with a face twisted by hatred, confessing she wanted to kill her own grandson. Elise saw Silas trembling, his entire body trembling, and yet he stayed upright. He wasn't finished. He still needed more. He needed the whole truth, no matter how brutal it was. Silas drew a deep breath, forcing his body to steady, forcing the trembling to obey him. He knew he couldn't stop here. There was one more truth he had to hear, even if that truth would destroy him down to the bone. "And Caroline?" he asked, his voice low and slow, each word coming out as if he were lifting a stone that weighed 1,000 pounds. He slid the car maintenance file across the desk and set it directly in front of Helena. You requested service on her car 2 days before the accident. Why? Helena went quiet. For the first time since the confrontation began, she didn't have an answer ready. Her eyes blinked fast, as if she were searching for a believable explanation, a way out of the dead end her son had backed her into. I only wanted to make sure the car was safe for my daughter-in-law, Helena finally said, and the sharpness from earlier drained out of her voice, leaving it thin and unconvincing. Caroline was going on a long trip with Mason. I was worried, so I asked someone to check the car. An accident is an accident. I had nothing to do with it. The brakes failed, Mother, Silas said, his voice turning to ice. Right after you had the car serviced. Right after you asked for it to be checked. Those brakes worked fine for 3 years, and then suddenly failed 2 days after you requested maintenance. You think that's a coincidence? Helena stood there, her face shifting through several expressions in a matter of seconds. From practiced calm, to anxiety, to fear, and then, when she realized there was no escape left, the last of her composure shattered completely. Fine, Helena screamed, her voice breaking into something feral. You want to hear it, I'll tell you. You want the truth? I'll give you the truth. That car crash wasn't an accident. I paid someone to sabotage the brakes. I wanted Caroline gone. The room dropped into a deadly silence. Elise felt the blood in her veins turn cold. Vincent stood by the door, and even his usual stone-cold face flickered with shock. And Silas, he stood frozen like a statue, as if his mother's confession had pulled the soul right out of his body. But the boy, Helena went on, her voice climbing higher, more unhinged. The boy was supposed to die with his mother. I planned everything. The brakes would fail going downhill. The car would go straight into the ravine, and they would both die. But the boy survived. He survived, and I still don't understand why. I checked. I made sure. And he still lived with only a few scratches. Helena kept talking, and now her voice carried the tone of someone who had finally abandoned every last disguise. 2 years earlier, she had planned Caroline's death. The goal was to remove the influence her daughter-in-law had over Silas, the woman who had turned her son into a stranger, the woman who had taken him out of his mother's hands. And Mason, the grandson carrying Caroline's blood, the child who would grow up to inherit instead of Derek. She wanted them both to vanish in a perfect car accident. But fate hadn't followed Helena's calculations. Caroline died. But Mason survived in a way that felt miraculous. The 3-year-old in the back seat lived while his mother died on impact. Helena waited, hoping Mason would die from internal injuries or from the shock that followed. But the boy lived. He grew. He remained the obstacle between Derek and the future Helena wanted for her younger son. When the ordinary way failed, I had to find another way, Helena said. And now her voice was calm in a way that was far more frightening, as if she were discussing the weather instead of a plot to kill her own grandson. I heard about Madame Celeste from someone I knew. I went to her and told her what I wanted. She said she needed an item from the dead that was tied to the target, so the work would be strongest. I paid someone to dig up Caroline's grave and take the wedding ring from her hand. I provided Mason's hair. I provided his nails. I paid, and I waited. Helena looked straight into Silas's eyes, and there wasn't a trace of regret in hers. I did everything for Derek. For Derek's future. He deserves to inherit this empire, not you, and certainly not the child of the woman who ruined my family. Silas stood there, unable to speak. He felt as if the ground beneath him had collapsed, as if the whole world he'd ever known was breaking into a million pieces. His mother had killed his wife. She had tried to kill his son once through a car crash. And when that failed, she had tried to kill his son a second time through a curse. Everything he had believed about family, about blood, about a mother's love, was a lie. Caroline hadn't died in an accident. She had been murdered by her own mother-in-law, the same woman who had smiled at her every day while planning her death. You don't understand. Helena kept talking, her tone turning into the self-justifying cadence of someone who believed she was right. I did it all for the family. Derek is my son. He deserves to be loved. He deserves to be protected. And you only care about work. You never needed me. You had the whole world. Power, money, everything. Derek had nothing but me. I had to help him. No one else would. Elise stood in the corner, watching it all with a heart that felt crushed in a fist. She had seen terrible things in her life, had watched death, had lived beside pain and loss in the hospital every day, but she had never seen anything like this. A mother turned into a monster by blind favoritism. A son losing everything in one morning. Losing his wife a second time by learning the truth of her death. Losing his mother by realizing she was the murderer. And Elise understood that sometimes the most dangerous enemy wasn't out there, not rivals in the underworld, not enemies waiting in the dark. The most dangerous enemy was inside your own home, sitting at your table every day, smiling and speaking of love while holding a knife behind their back. Silas finally spoke, his voice ice cold, stripped of all feeling. "You killed my wife. You tried to kill my son. Twice." He looked straight into Helena's eyes, and in that stare there was no longer a son's love for his mother, only distance and cold estrangement. "You are not my mother anymore." Silas stood there, staring at the woman who had given birth to him, who had raised him, and who now stood in front of him, with a face twisted by hatred after admitting she had killed his wife and tried to kill his son. He was Silas Hartley, the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago, the man who could make anyone disappear without a trace. He could have his mother killed right now, right here, with nothing more than a nod to Vincent. No one would dare ask, no one would dare question, no one would dare challenge his decision. In his world, blood for blood was the rule, but Silas didn't do it. Instead, he pulled his phone from his pocket, dialed 911, and lifted it to his ear. Helena saw what he was doing, and her expression shifted from arrogance to shock. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "You're calling the police? You're going to hand your mother over to the police? Your own mother?" Silas didn't look at her. He only gave the dispatcher the estate's address and said they needed to come immediately because there was a homicide to be handled. When he ended the call, he turned back to Helena, his eyes cold as ice. "I'm not handing my mother to the police," he said slowly. "I'm handing a murderer to justice." Helena exploded. She lunged for Silas, but Vincent moved faster, blocking her and pinning her arms. "You'll regret this," Helena screamed, her voice tearing through the air in the study. "I'm the one who gave birth to you. Without me, you are nothing. You were a child no one even looked at until I raised you, until I made you, until I taught you how to be a man. And this is how you treat me?" Silas didn't answer. He simply turned his back, facing the window, looking out over the wide front lawn of the estate. "Derek will never forgive you," Helena kept screaming. "You're going to lose your brother and your mother. You'll have no one. You'll be alone for the rest of your life. Do you hear me? Alone for the rest of your life." Silas still didn't turn around. He stood with his back straight, shoulders rigid, a stone statue in the middle of a storm. 15 minutes later, police sirens sounded beyond the gate. 2 patrol cars rolled into the driveway, and 4 officers stepped out. Vincent led them into the study, and they cuffed Helena Hartley, reading her Miranda rights as if she were an ordinary criminal and not the mother of the most powerful Mafia boss in the city. "Silas!" Helena screamed as they led her toward the door, and now the arrogance was gone, replaced by panic and desperation. "Look at me. You can't do this to me. I'm the one who gave birth to you. I love you. I did everything for the family, for you, for Derek. You can't abandon me." Silas didn't turn around. He stood with his back to her, staring out the window as if he couldn't hear a thing. Helena's screams echoed down the hall, spilled down the staircase, carried into the front yard, and then faded as she was pushed into the police car. The engine started. The siren's wail grew smaller as the car drove away from the estate, and then there was silence. Complete silence. Silas still stood there, unmoving. Elise saw his shoulders begin to shake, lightly at first, then harder, until his whole body trembled like a leaf in a storm. She stepped closer, moved around to see his face, and she saw something that perhaps no one in Chicago had ever witnessed. Silas Hartley was crying. Tears ran quietly down his angular face, falling to the floor in small drops. The most notorious Mafia boss in the city, the man the entire underworld feared, stood alone in his study and cried like a child who had lost everything. Elise didn't speak. She didn't offer hollow comfort, didn't say everything would be fine, didn't say he'd done the right thing. She simply stood beside him in silence, letting him know he wasn't alone, letting him know there was someone here with him in the darkest moment of his life. Sometimes a quiet presence was the only thing that mattered. "Caroline," Silas whispered, his voice breaking with pain. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. For 2 years I didn't know. I let my mother kill you and I never knew." Elise reached out, took Silas's hand where it hung at his side, and squeezed gently. That night, after the police car carrying Helena drove away from the estate, Silas ordered a new room prepared for Mason. He didn't want his son to sleep one more night in the room that had held 6 months of nightmares, the room where the cursed pillow had tormented the boy night after night. The new room was right next to Silas's bedroom, brighter, with a large window facing east to catch the first light of morning. Rosa cleaned it with eyes still red from crying. She changed the sheets, set a new pillow, laid out a new blanket, all of it purchased that afternoon, untouched by anyone, pristine and clean. Silas also brought a priest to the estate to pray over Mason's old room. The elderly priest recited prayers in a warm, steady voice, sprinkling holy water into the four corners, asking for peace and for any lingering darkness to be driven out. After the priest left, Rosa asked for permission to perform a small ritual from her Mexican tradition. She lit a bundle of sage, letting white smoke drift through the old room, whispering prayers in Spanish she had learned from her grandmother as a child. Elise watched from the doorway. She didn't believe in the supernatural, didn't believe in charms or curses. She belonged to science and medicine. But she understood the value of rituals like these. Sometimes the mind needed healing along with the body. Sometimes people needed symbolic actions to mark the end of a dark chapter and the beginning of a new one. For Mason, those rituals would help him believe the darkness had truly been pushed away, that he was safe, that nothing could hurt him anymore. When night fell, Elise sat beside Mason's bed in the new room, watching him clutch an old teddy bear against his chest. She began to sing a soft lullaby, a simple melody her mother used to sing to her when she was little, words about stars and sweet dreams. Mason listened, his wide eyes slowly growing heavy, his small body easing into the comfort of the new mattress. "Miss Elise," the boy murmured, his voice already thick with sleep. "Where is Grandma?" Elise kept stroking his hair, her voice gentle and steady. "Grandma had to go away for a while. You don't need to worry, just sleep. Everything will be all right." Mason stayed quiet for a moment, then whispered, "I'm not scared anymore. My new pillow doesn't talk. I like this pillow." Elise's heart tightened at the words, but she didn't let it show. She kept singing, kept smoothing his hair, until Mason's breathing became slow and deep, until he slipped fully into sleep. For the first time in 6 months, Mason slept without screaming. For the first time in 6 months, there was no nightmare ripping him awake at 2 a.m. For the first time in 6 months, the boy's face looked peaceful in sleep. No lines of worry, no cold sweat, only the calm of a 5-year-old dreaming gentle dreams. Silas stood outside the door, watching through the narrow crack left open. He watched his son sleeping soundly. He watched Elise still sitting by the bed, keeping vigil, and tears slid down his cheeks again. But this time they weren't tears of pain, not tears of anger or despair. These were tears of relief, the tears of a father finally seeing his child at peace. Rosa stood beside Silas, crying too. "He finally gets to sleep," she whispered. "He finally gets to rest." The next morning, when the first sunlight poured through the window, Mason woke after 6 uninterrupted hours. He sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes, and looked around the new room with a wonder as if he couldn't believe he'd just lived through a whole night without being dragged awake by nightmares. Then he jumped down and ran out, down the stairs, into the dining room where Silas was waiting. "Dad," Mason called out, and on his mouth was a bright smile. "The first in 6 months. I slept so well. I didn't have nightmares. I dreamed about Mommy, Dad. She was so beautiful. She said she loves me." Silas rose, went to his son, dropped to one knee, and pulled the boy into his arms. He held him tight, felt the warmth of him, felt the steady beat of that small heart, and he whispered into the boy's ear, "Mommy loves you, and I love you too, forever." A week passed after Helena was arrested. Mason had settled again. He slept well every night in the new room beside his father's. No nightmares, no screams in the middle of the night. He began eating normally, his cheeks growing rosier, gaining nearly 4 pounds, and his smile returned to that innocent face. Elise's work at the Hartley estate was done. She'd been called in to care for a sleepless child, and now that child was healthy. There was no reason for her to stay. Elise packed her few belongings, preparing to leave the next morning, to return to her cramped little apartment and the endless long shifts at Cook County Hospital. On her last night at the estate, Elise couldn't sleep. She stepped out onto the second-floor balcony, where she could see all of Chicago glittering with lights in the dark. She leaned against the railing, watching the city, trying not to think about leaving tomorrow, leaving Mason, leaving Silas. "You're going to leave without saying goodbye?" Silas's voice came from behind her. Elise turned and saw him standing in the balcony doorway, still in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His black hair slightly mussed as if he hadn't been sleeping either. "I thought it would be easier that way," Elise answered, turning back to the city. Easier for who? Silas asked, stepping up beside her. For me, Elise admitted, and maybe for you too. Silas didn't speak for a while. He just stood next to her, staring out at Chicago's blinking lights. Then he began to talk, his voice low and slow, as if he were opening a door that had been locked for years. You know, Caroline was the first person who looked at me like I was human, he said, gray eyes fixed on the night. To everyone else, I was Silas Hartley, the Mafia boss, the killer, the monster. They feared me, or they wanted to use me, or they wanted to kill me. No one saw who I was behind all those names, but Caroline was different. With her, I was just Silas, a normal man, a man who could love, who could laugh, who could cry. She was the only one who ever saw the real me. Silas paused and drew a deep breath. When she died, I thought I would never feel anything again. I thought the human part of me died with her. All I had left was the shell, the cold Mafia boss everyone was afraid of. I only lived for Mason, only for my son. He was the only reason I still got up every morning. He turned to Elise, and in those gray eyes there was a look she'd never seen before. Then you came, he said. You walked into this house like you didn't even know who I was, like I was just a normal father worrying about his child. You weren't afraid of me. You didn't want my money. You didn't need anything from me. You just wanted to save my son, a child you'd never met, never known. You spoke straight to my face, told me to control myself, argued with me when you thought I was wrong. No one in Chicago would dare do that. But you did. And you made me feel again. For the first time in 2 years, I felt something other than pain and emptiness. Elise stayed silent, her heart beating faster. She wanted to say something, but her throat felt tight. Then she began to speak, her voice small and shaking, as if she were pulling open a wound she'd tried to keep covered for a long time. I had a little brother, she said. Tommy. He was 5 years younger than me. Silas turned to her, listening. 2 years ago, Tommy had a heart condition. Elise continued, her voice trembling harder. He needed surgery urgently. The doctor said if he didn't have it within 3 months, he would die. I'm a nurse. I work in a hospital. I understood what was happening to him, but I didn't have enough money to save him. $180,000. I didn't have it. I took extra shifts, borrowed everywhere I could, sold everything that had any value, but it still wasn't enough. Tears began to slide down Elise's cheeks, but she didn't stop. Tommy died on the operating table, she said, her voice breaking. We waited too long to gather the money, and when we finally had it, it was too late. His heart was too weak to survive the surgery. He died when he was 22, with his whole life ahead of him, and I couldn't do anything to save him. Elise turned to Silas, hazel eyes drowned in tears. Every day I go to work, I see sick children, desperate families, people who can't afford treatment, and I remember Tommy. I didn't save Mason for you, Mr. Hartley. I saved him because I don't want anyone else to lose the person they love. I don't want another father to bury his child. I don't want anyone else to live with the pain I'm carrying. They stood in silence beside each other on the balcony, looking out over the night city. Both of them had lost the person who mattered most. Both of them carried wounds that would never fully heal. But standing there together, those wounds seemed to ache a little less. The loneliness felt lighter, and the darkness didn't feel quite as frightening. Silas reached out and took Elise's hand where it rested on the railing. Don't go, he said, his voice rough and full of feeling. I don't belong in this world, Silas, Elise replied, using his name for the first time instead of calling him Mr. Hartley. I'm just a nurse. You belong anywhere you want, Silas said, tightening his hold on her hand. And I want you here, with me, with Mason. He leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to Elise's mouth. It wasn't a blazing, desperate kiss. It wasn't a fierce hunger. It was soft and full of feeling. A kiss between two broken souls who had finally found each other. A kiss between two people who had lost everything and were learning how to hope again. Small footsteps sounded behind them, and they both startled and turned. Mason stood in the balcony doorway, wide-eyed and amazed, mouth open. Dad kissed Miss Elise, the boy blurted, his voice bright with shock and delight. A week after that night on the balcony, Silas asked Elise to come to his study. She walked in and found him seated behind the familiar oak desk, a large white envelope set in front of him. Silas rose when he saw her, his expression serious but his eyes warm. This is my thank you, he said, sliding the envelope toward Elise. You saved my son when no one else could. Not 18 expensive specialists flown in from all over the world. Not the millions of dollars I poured into this. You, a nurse from a public hospital, the one person who did the simplest thing no one else thought to do. You listened to my child. Elise opened the envelope and went still when she saw the check inside. $500,000. More money than she might earn in a lifetime. Mr. Hartley, she said, her voice shaking. Then she stopped and corrected herself. Silas, I can't take this. I didn't do it for money. I told you. I know, Silas said, coming around the desk to stand in front of her. That's exactly why I want you to take it. You didn't do it for money. You did it out of kindness, out of empathy, because you didn't want anyone else to lose the person they love. But kindness doesn't mean you have to live in poverty. Decency doesn't mean you have to refuse what you deserve. He held her gaze. You told me your brother died because you didn't have enough money for his treatment. How many families out there are facing the same thing right now? How many children are waiting to die because their parents don't have $180,000? Use this money for them, Elise. For children like Tommy. Start a fund. Help families who can't pay for their child's care. Turn your pain into something that matters. Elise looked down at the check in her hand, her heart knocking wildly in her chest. She thought of Tommy, of his smile, of the nights she stayed awake doing the math again and again, trying to figure out who she could borrow from next. She thought of the hundreds of families she had met at Cook County, mothers crying in hospital corridors, fathers powerless as they watched their children fade, kids who didn't understand why they had to hurt, while the world outside kept turning. I'll take it, Elise finally said, lifting her head to look at Silas. But on one condition. $400,000 will be used to create the Tommy Monroe Fund, dedicated to helping poor children pay their hospital bills. And $100,000 I'll keep to pay off the remaining medical debt from Tommy's surgery and to stabilize my life. Silas smiled. One of the rare smiles Elise had ever seen from him. That's why I love you, he said softly. After that, Silas called Rosa into the room. The nanny walked in looking anxious, not sure what she'd done wrong. But instead of scolding her, Silas handed her another envelope. Rosa opened it and nearly collapsed when she saw the check for $100,000 inside. You were the first person to realize Mason was being harmed, Silas said, his voice sincere. You're the one who called Elise in when no one else believed something was wrong. Without you, none of this would have happened. My son could have died. Rosa broke down, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she sobbed. Thank you for believing me. When I was suspected, when all the evidence pointed at me, Nurse Elise was the only one who gave me a chance to explain. Silas rested a hand on Rosa's shoulder. Your instinct saved my son. Don't ever let anyone tell you your faith has no value. Don't ever let anyone make you doubt yourself. Rosa decided she would use the money to bring her mother from Mexico to the United States for treatment. Her mother would be cared for in the best hospitals, would be allowed to spend her final days with dignity and kindness. And Rosa would continue as Mason's nanny, the boy she loved like her own child, the boy who had given her a reason to keep living after Miguel's death. That night, Elise sat alone in her room, staring at the check in her hand. She thought of Tommy, of his bright smile, of his dream of becoming a teacher, a dream he never got the chance to live. Little brother, she whispered as tears rolled down her cheeks, I'm going to save other children in your name. You won't have died for nothing. Your name will live on in the hearts of the children the Tommy Monroe Fund saves. 6 months later, Helena Hartley stood before federal court facing charges of first-degree murder for Caroline Hartley and conspiracy to commit murder against Mason Hartley. The trial lasted 3 weeks, stacked with evidence that couldn't be denied. From Madame Celeste's testimony to the vehicle maintenance records, from phone messages to the confession Vincent had recorded on the day of the confrontation, the jury needed only 4 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on every count. Helena Hartley was sentenced to 25 years in prison without parole. Throughout the trial, and even when the sentence was read, she showed no remorse. She stood with her chin lifted, insisting she'd been right, insisting everything she'd done was for the family, for Derek, for the future of the Hartley bloodline. Silas didn't attend the trial. He'd said goodbye to his mother the day the police car took her from the estate, and he had no need to see her ever again. Derek Hartley left Chicago right after his mother was arrested. He enrolled in a gambling addiction program in another city, attended weekly therapy, and tried to rebuild his life from the rubble. Every month, Derek called Mason, talking to his nephew about school, about friends, about ordinary things an ordinary uncle would ask. He was trying to become a good uncle, even though he knew the road ahead was still long. Silas allowed the calls, but kept his distance. He wasn't ready to forgive completely, and maybe he never would be. But he also didn't want Mason to lose the last remaining relative on his father's side. Mason was 6 now, a cheerful, healthy boy, nothing like the pale, gaunt child of 6 months earlier. He'd gained 11 pounds, shot up in height, his cheeks always rosy, his eyes always bright. He went to a private school near home, had friends, was loved by his teachers, and most important, he slept well every night. No more nightmares, no more screaming at midnight, no more invisible terror. Mason had been given back the childhood he deserved. The Tommy Monroe Fund had been officially operating for 4 months and had helped 47 families pay hospital bills for their children. 47 children had received surgery, treatment, had been saved by the money from the fund. Silas quietly contributed more each month, without needing anyone to know, without wanting credit. He only wanted to help because it was the right thing to do. Elise ran the fund. She made sure every dollar reached the people who truly needed it. Not a cent wasted, not a penny lost. Elise still worked as a nurse at Cook County Hospital. She didn't give up the work she loved even though she no longer had to worry about money. But her life had changed. She had a new apartment in a safer area, a new car she could rely on, and every weekend she went to the Hartley estate to be with Silas and Mason. Silas and Elise dated slowly, not rushing, respecting each other, letting their feelings grow in their own natural way. They both carried wounds from the past, and they understood healing took time. Mason had recently started calling Elise my Miss Elise instead of just Miss Elise the way he used to. One weekend, when the 3 of them were sitting together at breakfast, the boy suddenly looked up and asked, "Miss Elise, can you be my mom?" Elise didn't answer right away. She only pulled him into her arms and held him tight, hazel eyes shimmering with tears. Silas watched them, and on his mouth was a smile, the first true smile he'd worn in years. Now Elise sat in her small office at the hospital, looking up at the wall where 2 drawings Mason had made for her were hanging. The first was a family picture, with tall Dad Silas, little Mason, and Miss Elise beside them with brown hair and a wide smile. The second showed Mason running through a park under bright golden sunlight, blue sky and green grass, a picture overflowing with joy and hope. She thought about the strange path that had brought her here, from a poor nurse answering a late-night call to a woman who had saved a child, exposed a horrifying family plot, and found love in the last place she'd ever expected. She'd learned that sometimes miracles came from the simplest actions, that listening, especially listening to children, could save a life, and that you didn't have to be rich to be a hero. You only had to be brave enough to listen and kind enough to act. This story gives us a deep lesson about the value of listening and kindness. In busy life, we often overlook the small voices, the quiet pleas from the people around us, especially children. But sometimes those small voices carry the most important truths. Remember, money and status don't always solve the problem. Genuine love and sincere care are the keys that can open any door. How did this story make you feel? Did it touch your heart? In real life, have you ever been in a situation where listening made a difference? We'd truly love to hear what you feel deep in your heart, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked this story, don't forget to hit like and share this video with the people you love. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, subscribe now so you won't miss our daily stories. We sincerely thank you for watching all the way to the last minute. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.